benedicta tu in mulieribus.
This is part 2, The Blood of the Martyrs, the Seed of the Church. Please like the video, comment anything I may have missed or gotten wrong, share, and subscribe. Let us begin with a prayer taken from For All the Saints. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. For all the saints who from their labors rest, who thee by faith before the world confessed, thy name, O Jesus, O be forever blessed. Alleluia, alleluia. Thou wast their rock, their fortress, and their might. Thou, Lord, their captain in the well-fought fight. Thou in the darkness drear their one true light. Alleluia, alleluia. O blessed communion, fellowship divine, we feebly struggle, they in glory shine. Yet all are one in thee, for all are thine. Alleluia, alleluia. All right, let's continue our comprehensive study of the 3rd century martyrs and saints. This video. Saint Faustus, Abibus, and Dionysius of Alexandria also died in 250. Faustus was a priest, Abibus was a deacon, and Dionysius a lector. They were executed with several others during the Decian persecution in Alexandria by Governor Valerius. Saints Philinus and Gratian also died in 250. They were martyred soldiers in the army of Emperor Trajanus Decius at Perugia, Italy. Saint Fusca and Marura. Fusca was born into a pagan family of Ravenna. When she was about 15, she expressed her interest in studying Christianity to her nurse, Marura. The two of them visited a priest named Ermolus. They were subsequently baptized. Fusca's father tried to persuade her to apostatize. When she refused, he turned her over to the Roman officials. A squad was dispatched to arrest her, but they fled when they saw an angel draw a sword to protect her. Later, they voluntarily surrendered to Quantianus, the same proconsul who had St. Agatha executed. They both died by the sword. St. Helicanus. Helicanus was a Thessalonican who moved to Corinth during the Decian persecution. She stood up against the pagan persecution publicly. Being brought before the governor Perinus, she was implored to offer idolatrous sacrifices, which she refused. She was then tortured and cast into a furnace, but was unharmed. She then had the skin peeled off of her head and had her breasts and head burned with fire. She was then given a chance to adore idols. She asked to have some alone time with the idols, and during this time, she destroyed all of them through her prayers. She was cast into a prison for 5 days. Jesus and Mary appeared to her. After this, she was cast into the arena, but the lions would not attack her. Instead, they turned on the crowd. In this chaos, she was beheaded. Again, in 250. Saint Heron. Eusebius tells us succinctly about this Alexandrian martyr. Of those who were conspicuous in Alexandria for their zeal, Heron, Ater, Isidorus, and others were beheaded. Saints Lucian and Marcion. Lucian and Marcion were practitioners of sorcery, who lived in Nicomedia, a city about 40 miles south of Nicaea. When their curses were ineffective against a certain Christian woman, they investigated her faith and ultimately converted. They then made a public show of the burning of their sorcerers' books and gave themselves over to the preaching of the gospel. When condemned to death, they said, quote, "We are ready to suffer, but we will not renounce the true God, lest we be cast into a fire which shall never be quenched." Thus, they were sentenced to death by being burned alive. The same year, St. Maximus of Aquila died. He was a deacon from Avaia in central Italy. He was tortured and then thrown over a cliff to his death. St. Maximus of Nola was the bishop of Nola who ordained St. Felix. He fled to the mountains during the persecution of Decian and died as a result of his sufferings in exile. St. Metranus. According to Eusebius, they seized first an old man named Metras and commanded him to utter impious words. But as he would not obey, they beat him with clubs and tore his face and eyes with sharp sticks, and dragged him out of the city and stoned him. St. Minias, or Miniatu, died in 250. He is the first Christian martyr of the city of Florence. The hagiographical tradition regards him as a prince of Armenia who served in the Roman military and ultimately decided to settle near Florence as a hermit ascetic. He was outed as a Christian during the persecution of Decius and was sentenced to being thrown into a furnace, being stoned, and being cast before wild beasts in the amphitheater. He was unharmed by each of these torments. He was finally beheaded in Piazza della Signoria. Some hagiographical traditions regard him as one of the Cephalophori, who picked up his head and continued to preach after his decapitation. Saint Mosius and Ammonius, also in 250, were martyred Roman soldiers. They were sentenced to life imprisonment in the mines of Bithynia, and they were then burned alive. Saint Nemesion, also in 250. He was an Egyptian and was one of the martyrs at Alexandria under Decius. He suffered about the same time as Saint Macarius, and to make his passion more humiliating, he was burned at the stake between two thieves. Eusebius the historian had these and other particulars collected from an account written by Saint Dionysius, the patron of Alexandria, who was a contemporary to these martyrs. Saint Parmenion and his companions. Eager to enforce Decius' decree of persecution of Christians, the Roman governor Aquinus imprisoned 370 Christians of Bithynia in his prison. Each were given the chance to sacrifice to idols. One of them, Parmenion, stood up amongst the others to denounce the wickedness of the pagan governor and to proclaim the kingship of Christ. Each one of these prisoners were beheaded. Saint Pianius was a Roman priest whose martyrdom was recorded in both the martyrdom of Pianius the presbyter and his companions. He received a dream of his impending martyrdom the night before he died, similar to the vision granted to Polycarp. Subsequently, Pianius was martyred on the birthday of Saint Polycarp. As he was arrested, he preached against the errors of Judaism and Greek paganism philosophy. Subsequently, he was racked with hooks, scourged, and burned alive. Saint Saturnius of Rome was ordained a bishop after service as a priest in Rome. Pope Fabian sent him to preach in Gaul as a missionary. He settled his episcopal chair in Toulouse. An account of Fortunatus states that he had great success in converting the pagans and worked a good deal of miracles. Between the church he erected and his home was a pagan temple with a number of oracles within. However, the oracles received no words from their demon spirits due to his close proximity. Arrested, he was demanded to offer sacrifice to idols, to which he responded, "I adore only one God, and to him I am ready to offer a sacrifice of praise. Your gods are devils and are more delighted with the sacrifice of your souls than with those of your bullocks. How can I fear them who, as you acknowledge, tremble before a Christian?" He was then tied to a bull which dragged him down a hill, shattering his skull and releasing his brains. Saints Secundum, Marcialian, and Varian. These three companions were martyred near Civitavecchia, or Santa Marinella, in 250 A.D. The three at first enthusiastically persecuted Christians. However, reading the following poem of Virgil, they each converted. The poem reads, "Now has come the last age of Suminian prophecy. The great cycle of periods is born anew. Now returns the maid, returns the reign of Saturn. Now from high heaven a new generation comes down. Yet do thou at that boy's birth, in whom the iron rays shall begin to cease, and the golden to arise over all the earth. Holy Lucina, be gracious. Be now thine own Apollo reigns." Each of these martyrs, who originally persecuted other martyrs, were themselves scourged and beheaded. Saint Secundina. She was a martyred virgin. She was flogged to death during the persecution of Emperor Trajanus Decius in Rome. The 10 martyrs of Crete. Theodulus, Saturninus, Epirus, Galasius, Eunician were all from Gortyn, Zoticus from Knossos, Pompeius from Labena, Agathopos from Panamoros, Basilides from Cydonia, and Everastus from Heraklion. Each of them were sentenced to death for refusing to offer imperial worship to Decius at the shrine in Crete. After being imprisoned and tortured for a month, they were each beheaded. Saint Troadius. He was a martyr and was executed in Neo-Caesarea, Pontus, in modern Turkey, by crucifixion during the reign of Emperor Trajanus Decius. The 7 sleepers of Ephesus are certainly an interesting story. These 7 Christians fled the persecution of Decius and hid in a cave of Ephesus, and their story was so famous that it even reached the ears of the Arab people and eventually found its way into the Quran. A wide variety of ancient historians and hagiographers told of the story, though Gregory of Tours was the best early example. Basically, after being put on trial for their faith, they knew they were going to be executed, and they retired to a cave to live lives of penance and prayer until they were martyred. Decius heard of this, however, and he ordered that the cave be closed in behind them. It was presumed, naturally, therefore, that they had died as martyrs inside of the cave. In the middle of the 5th century, a shepherd opened the cave, thinking it would serve as a good den for his herd, being ignorant of its history. This awoke the saints, even though it was about 2 centuries later. They imagined, however, that they had only slept a day. They sent one of their number to go to the city to purchase food. He was utterly astounded to see crosses on buildings. He was brought to be questioned by the bishop, and after they were each summoned to give testimony to what work God had accomplished in them, they each died peacefully. If you want to read from the Quran of the story of the 7 sleepers, the Quran, of course, doesn't talk about their faith in Christ himself, but their faith in God. And I have all of it pasted here, so if you want to pause, you can read what the Quran says about what they call the 7 sleepers, or the 7 martyrs of Ephesus. It continues here. This is the cave according to Islamic tradition. It's quite a few little verses, or whatever they call them, in the Quran. Saint Troadius was executed in Neo-Caesarea, Pontus, by crucifixion during the reign of Decius. Again, this is still all in the year 250. Saint Venantius of Camerino was 15 years old when he was apprehended for his faith. He was martyred along with a priest named Porphyrius, who was also Venantius' tutor, as well as Leontius, the bishop of Camerino. Venantius was burned, scourged, hanged upside down over fire, had his teeth knocked out, had his jaw broken, was thrown before lions, was tossed off a cliff, and was eventually decapitated. Saint Visa. She was a virgin martyr. She was put to death in Fermo, near Ancona, Italy, during the persecutions of Emperor Trajanus Decius. Saint Polyectus. Polyectus was a wealthy officer in the Roman legion in Armenia, the Legio XII Fulminata. Polyectus was inspired by his friend, also in the legion, named Saint Nearchus, to become a Christian. In defiance of Decius' edict of persecution, Polyectus once interrupted a pagan procession and personally destroyed the 12 idols of the procession. As he was tortured and killed for this crime, he manfully ignored the pleas of his wife, children, and father-in-law to give up his faith and save his earthly life. He died in 259 AD. Back in 251, St. Alexander of Cappadocia and Jerusalem died. He was the bishop of Cappadocia. He had been imprisoned during the persecution of Severus. He was released in Alia Capitolina, the name the Romans gave to Jerusalem after destroying it, from the Borcoba rebellion in the early 2nd century. He was compelled by St. Narcissus of Jerusalem to co-rule the holy city alongside him, since St. Narcissus, as we mentioned earlier, was pressed into being the Bishop of Jerusalem once again, well past his 100th year. It was this Bishop of Alexander who granted Origen permission to teach in the churches, although he was a layman. Later, he participated in Origen's ordination as a priest. Subsequently, he was involved in heated disputes about Origen's canonical status with St. Demetrius, the Pope of Alexandria. According to Thomas Campbell's article on St. Alexander, quote, he, with several other bishops, were carried off a prisoner to Caesarea, and as the historians say, the glory of his white hairs and great sanctity formed a double crown for him in captivity. He suffered many tortures, but survived them all. When the wild beasts were brought to devour him, some licked his feet, and others there impressed on the sand of the arena. Worn out by his sufferings, he died in prison in the year 251. St. Agatha. She was a Sicilian young Catholic woman who died during the persecution of Emperor Decius in the 250s. Modern historians doubt much of her hagiography due to the centuries which were removed from her death and the first written records of her passion, although modern historians frequently doubt the ability of ancient people to keep things alive through careful oral tradition. 5th and 6th century catalogues of saints list her as being venerated on February 5th. Her purity was remembered and venerated especially in the Sicilian Catholic Church, but also in Rome, where an early basilica bore her name. The acts of the martyrdom of Agatha, which we possess in Latin and Greek, recount her sacrifice. The young Agatha was courted by the powerful senator Quintianus. She denied his requests, as she was committed to a vocation of consecrated virginity. Quintianus had Agatha forcibly placed under the charge of a wicked and loose woman who failed to break Agatha's invincible purity. Ultimately, Quintianus resorted to torturing Agatha, a cruel plight which included severing her breasts. She ultimately died from these tortures in 251. That same year, the brothers Alpheus, Philadelphus, and Cyrinus died alongside their mother, Saint Benedicta. They were from southern Italy. Alpheus' tongue was torn from his mouth, Philadelphus was burned at the stake, Cyrinus was boiled in oil, and Benedicta was also executed alongside her sons. The same year, Saints Cyrilis and Sallustia died. He was a soldier, and his wife, they were both martyred in Rome. They were converted by Pope Saint Cornelius. Cyrilis and Sallustia were slain during the persecution of Decius. Saints Kalinica and Basilissa were wealthy matrons who provided food and material support to Christian prisoners. They were thus questioned and discovered to be Christians. Both were executed for this act of mercy. Saint Conan the Gardener also died in 251. He was born in Nazareth, but he lived most of his life in Mondana, an obscure ancient Roman city not attested to outside of Conan's hagiography. For most of his life he lived a humble existence. He was executed for his faith by being nailed to a chariot and then being dragged through the city until he died. Saints Galation or Galaction and Saint Episteme. Galaction was the son of Cleitophon and Leucippe, wealthy pagan couple who suffered from infertility until their conversion to the one true God, which was conditional upon being granted a child. Galaction longed to become a monk, but he relented to his parents' desires to be wed to Episteme. During their engagement, Galaction converted Episteme and her servant Euthymius, and they received baptism. Though they were wed, they both retired to form separate monasteries or abbeys. They did not see each other again until their deaths. Galaction was sentenced to beheading. When Episteme heard of this, she went to join her husband, and she died at his side. Saint Maximus was a lay merchant who used his charismatic charm to convert a great many pagan souls to the Catholic faith. Once, as a pagan festival created a loud spectacle in the city streets, he could not tolerate the indecency any longer. He charged into their midst, denouncing their stupidity and wickedness. He referred to their idols as lifeless, and was stoned to death as a result. Meningitus was a layman and a dyer. When Decius' edict of persecution was hung on a wall, he tore it down in protest. As a result, his fingers were hacked off, and then he was executed. Saint Moses of Rome. Saint Moses was a priest and a martyr who, with others detained in prison, was often consoled by the letters of Saint Cyprian, who was also a martyr. After he had withstood with unbending courage not only the pagans, but also the Novatian schismatics and heretics, he was finally, in the persecutions of Decius, crowned with the martyrdom which fills the minds with admiration, according to the words of Pope Saint Cornelius. Saint Myrope. She lost her father at an early age, but her mother raised her to have an intimate bond with her father in heaven. She frequently visited the tomb of Saint Hermione, the daughter of Saint Philip the Apostle. She used myrrh which excreted from her relics to heal the sick. During the great persecution of Decius, Myrope and her mother moved to the island of Chios to live a life of penance and sacrifice. While there, Saint Isidore was martyred. Myrope had his body properly buried. The soldiers who permitted Myrope to do this were sentenced to death. She then turned herself in so to console the souls of the soldiers. She was fiercely beaten and thrown into a cell. While in prison, a great light fell upon her. Saint Isidore appeared. Subsequently, the whole prison smelled sweet. Yet another guard converted, and she surrendered her life to God, dying from her beatings. Saint Pergentinus, Larentinus, and Clarina. Saint Pergentinus was a 3rd century martyr. He and his brother and sister, Saints Laurentius and Clarina, were put to death near Carthage during the reign of Decius. Their nephew Salernus suffered so extremely that he also is termed a martyr, though he lived to be ordained a deacon by Saint Cyprian. Their feast day is February 3rd. Saint Peter of Lampsacus, Andrew, Paul, and Denise. These martyrs died at the Hellespont connecting Europe and Asia near what would become later Constantinople. When the companions were being tortured, Nicomachus was among their number. He abandoned the faith and renounced Christ. When he was invited to offer sacrifice to idols, he began to suffer a violent convulsion and died. Andrew and Paul were then racked and imprisoned. Denise was in the crowd and expressed distress at Nicomachus' apostasy. She was then tried and sentenced to be raped by 7 soldiers, but an angel prevented this. The lot of the soldiers were then executed by beheading. Saints Therisus, Lechius, and Callinicus. Saint Lechius approached the prefect Combricius of Bithynia to protest his persecution of Christians. For this, he was tortured and then executed. A catechumen named Saint Therisus was then arrested. When asked if he would offer incense to idols, he mocked the absurdity of idolatry. Therisus then had his limbs removed from their sockets, eyes gouged out, and his teeth smashed with hammers. He was then brought to a pagan temple By his prayers, the idol of Apollo was toppled. He was beaten more severely and was then finally beheaded. The pagan priest Callinicos was converted by the catechumen's witness. He, too, then died a martyr. This is all again in the year 251. The same year, Saints Trypho, Respicius, and Nympha all died as martyrs. Trypho was born at Campsara in Phrygia. His name meant softness, and he became known as a healer of sick animals. He was taken to Nicaea in 250 and was horrifically tortured and beheaded for his faith in Christ. He died alongside a Christian companion, Saint Respicius. Traditionally, Trypho shared a feast day with Respicius and Nympha. Nympha was a virgin saint from Palermo, Sicily. Saints Victorinus, Victor, Nicephorus, Claudius, Diodorus, Serapion, and Papias all died in 252. These saints were Saints Victorinus, Victor, and Nicephorus were tied to a stone mortar and were crushed by huge stone pestles. Saint Claudius died after his hands and feet were cut off. Saint Diodorus was burned, Saint Serapion beheaded, and Saint Papias was drowned in the sea. This leads us to the persecution of Emperor Valerian in the later half of the 250s AD. This brings us to the reign of our 21st Supreme Pontiff, St. Cornelius, from 251 to 253. According to St. Cyprian, Cornelius' election was determined by the judgment of God and of Christ, by the testimony of almost all the clergy, by the vote of the people then present, by the consent of aged priests and of good men, at a time when no one had been made before him, when the place of Fabian, that is, the place of Peter, and the step of the sacerdotal chair was vacant. When fortitude in his acceptance of the episcopate, what strength of mind, what firmness of faith, that he took his seat intrepid in the sacerdotal chair at a time when the tyrant in his hatred of bishops was making unspeakable threats, when he heard with far more patience that a rival prince was arising against him, than that a bishop of God was appointed at Rome. Cornelius, Cyprian is going out defending the virtue and the legitimacy of Pope Cornelius because there was an anti-pope elected in opposition to Cornelius, the leader of the Novatian heresy, which basically placed severe limitations on the sacrament of absolution. Cornelius accepted Cyprian's Carthaginian model of penance for repentant apostates. As a result, as I just mentioned, Novatian had himself elected pope by a group of supportive bishops, beginning the heresy or schism of Novatianism, which deemed it impossible to grant absolution to apostates, not merely imprudent, but impossible. Cyprian and Cornelius worked together to combat this heresy, which was present both in northern Africa as well as in Rome, and a number of their letters of correspondence have been passed on to us. You can learn more about those in my video on St. Cyprian in the same series. Cornelius told Cyprian that Novatian did not receive confirmation when he was baptized, because he was baptized under duress or fear of his death from an illness, and thus Cornelius doubted whether Novatian had ever even received the Holy Spirit at all. In 253, Cornelius was sent to Catumcelle as an exile. There he either died due to poor conditions or through beheading. Saints Victoria and Anatolia of Tivoli. Victoria was engaged to be martyred to the wealthy pagan Eugenius. Her fiancé asked her to convince his friend's betrothed, Saint Anatolia, to marry him, for she had recently declared that she was to remain a virgin. Victoria tried to speak of the beauty of the vocation of matrimony and the possibility of converting her powerful fiancé if she were to wed him. Anatolia, however, who had already consecrated herself in virginity, shared a vision in which she was told that virginity is an immense treasure of the King of Kings. As a result, Victoria herself was convinced to join Anatolia in consecrated chastity. As a result, she was locked in a tower and was starved until she would change her mind. When she did not, Eugenius, her husband, delivered her to the Roman governor to be beheaded, and she died alongside Anatolia. Saint Felician. Felician was born to a wealthy Christian, and that was in 253. You can always look up here for the years if I don't say it. Felician was born to a wealthy Christian family around the year 160. He especially studied the faith under Pope Eleutherius, who ruled from 174 to 189. Thereafter he preached in Filogna, Spella, Bevagna, Assisi, Perugia, Norcia, Plestia, Trevi, and Spoleto, all throughout Italy. Around 204, Pope Victor I consecrated him as the Bishop of Foligno. He is said to have been the first bishop to receive a palladium as a symbol of his office from the Holy Father. As bishop, he ordained St. Valentine as a priest. As a 94-year-old man, Felician was arrested. When he refused to sacrifice to idols, he was scourged. He was then to be transported to Rome to be executed, but he died from his wounds along the way. St. Lucius I, Pope from 253 to 254, he was a Roman and was born to a certain Porphyrius. He was exiled by Emperor Gallus, the same who had exiled Cornelius. However, with the ascension of Emperor Valerian, he was permitted to return to Rome. According to the Book of Popes, here he was in exile, and afterwards, by the will of God, he returned safe to the church. St. Cyprian wrote to him upon his return, saying, "Beloved brother, only a short time ago we offered you congratulations, when in exalting you to govern his church, God graciously bestowed upon you the twofold glory of confessor or martyr and bishop. Again we congratulate you, your companions, and the whole congregation, in that owing to the kind and mighty protection of our Lord, he has led you back with praise and glory to his own, so that the flock can again receive its shepherd, the ship her pilot, and the people a director to govern them, and show openly that it was God's disposition that he permitted your banishment, not that the bishop who had been expelled should be deprived of his church, but rather that he might return to his church with greater authority." The Book of Popes and his epitaph both refer to him as a martyr. Saint Tarchisius died in 255. Although young, Tarchisius was entrusted to bring the Eucharist to the Christians who were imprisoned during the persecution of Valerian. For this reason, many suspect that he was ordained a deacon. One 6th century account holds that he was in fact a deacon. A pagan mob demanded him that he turned over the Blessed Eucharist for them to desecrate. He chose instead to be beaten to death by the mob, then readily hand over his Lord to these monsters. According to Pope Damasus I, we have this poem. "When a maddened band pressed on you, holy Tarchisius, to display the consecrated things of Christ to the profane, you preferred to be killed and pour out your life, rather than betray the heavenly members to mad dogs." Saints Anastasia II and Cyril. She is believed to have been a young woman who lived with a group of Christian virgins in Rome. During the persecutions of Emperor Valerian, she was arrested and cruelly tortured by a prefect named Probus. When she asked for some water, a man named Cyril brought her some. For this kindness, he would share her fate in beheading. Saints Dionysius, Faustus, Gaius, Peter, Paul, and their companions. All these martyrs of Alexandria died in 200. In 250, they were all banished to Libya. They were then arrested and brought to Alexandria, where they were ultimately martyred around the year 257. The same year, Saints Eugenia, Protus, and Hyacinthus. We're going to read from The Passion of the Martyrs, Saints Protus and Hyacinthus. We're not going to read from it, but their passion was written in the latter half of the 5th century. The two of them, Protus and Hyacinth, served as eunuch chamberlains to Saint Eugenia in Egypt. He was the son of Philip, a high-ranking senator. Eugenia was the daughter of Philip, a high-ranking senator who was sent by Emperor Commodus to govern Egypt. When in Egypt, Eugenia devoted herself to study and denied several suitors in marriage. By chance, she stumbled upon the letters of St. Paul, and was immediately convinced by the Holy Spirit that only the God of the Catholic Church was the true God, and the gods of the pagans were demons. Her two chamberlains, Protus and Hyacinthus, went with her to visit their local bishop. In order to escape notice, she dressed in male garments and had her hair cut in the manner of a man. Her bishop recognized this disguise, but baptized her and her chamberlains besides. The three then fled to the desert to live amongst the ascetics in the desert. When the abbot of this community died, they elected Eugenia to lead them instead. Her learning made her a wise leader of this community, and she kept up her disguise this entire time. When a certain woman came to the monks for healing, Eugenia healed her by her prayers. She went by the name Eugene during this time. This woman ultimately lusted after Eugenia, but when the ascetic denied her advances, she accused her of trying to rape her. She was brought to trial for this, but then she revealed her identity to her father, Philip, who was still leading this region. She was then brought before the idol Diana, but at her prayers the idols crumbled, and fire from heaven struck her false accuser. After this, much of Alexandria converted, along with her father, who served as a bishop of Alexandria later in life, as well as a prefect of the city at the same time. As an old woman, Eugenia moved to Rome, where she helped lead a group of consecrated virgins. During this period, her and her chamberlains were sentenced to death under Valerian in 257. Saint Quadratus of Corinth died in 256. He was a healer and hermit who lived near Corinth. He lived in the mountains ever since his mother fled with him there to escape an earlier persecution, probably the persecution of Decius in 250, or another local persecution which we might not know about. This far ahead in history, we don't always have all the records of the local persecutions, which particular Roman prefects or governors might have undertaken all on their own, at their own pleasure. Christianity was never legal, but it wasn't always systematically being hunted out or sought out to be destroyed. Quadratus was arrested and pressured to offer sacrifice to idols along with his companions Cyprian, Dionysius, Annectus, Paul, and Crescens. When they refused, they were thrown to the wild beasts. When the beasts refused to eat them, they were each beheaded. Saints Rufina and Secunda. Rufina and Secunda were the daughters of the Roman senator Asterius. Both were engaged to Christian men, Armentarius and Verinus. However, their spouses apostatized when the persecution of Valerian began. Rufina and Secunda fled Rome to central Italy, but were then captured and decapitated in 257. St. Stephen I was the pope from 254 to 257. He was a Roman and was the son of a man named Jovius. Faustinus, bishop of Lyons, urged him to condemn Marcion, bishop of Arles, who preferred Novatus' teachings on the ability to provide absolution to the lapses, or the apostates. Stephen I did not respond to the bishops of Gaul, but after they implored Cyprian to urge him to act, it would seem that he did in fact do just that. He is well known for defending the validity of baptisms, even as performed by heretics, disagreeing with Cyprian on this matter. The Liber Pontificalis asserts that he decreed that ecclesiastical vestments were not to be worn outside of the liturgy, perhaps beginning the custom of creating distinctive sacred vestments for liturgical use. He organized a charitable fund for the Christians of Syria and Arabia. He is regarded as a martyr by the Liber Pontificalis. Let's talk a bit about Tertullian, who was not a saint. Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus, or Tertullian of Carthage, was born in Carthage in 155 AD. He referred to himself as a Punic among the Romans. Punic is, of course, the Latinization of the word Phoenician. His father was a Roman centurion, and he had a quality education as a lawyer, according to Eusebius. He was raised as a pagan, and he remained one until his Middle Ages. In his writings, he reflected not only on his loose style of living, but also his animosity toward Christianity. He was likely married during his pagan life. He addressed his wife in 2 of his books. Even in the early church, priests were barred from becoming married, and generally continence was expected within clerical marriages. The church preserves 31 of his treatises. This large number, carefully preserved, indicates that the sensus fidelium of the church always regarded his writings as worth reading, even though his legacy would be tarnished by his association with Montanism. He was the first theologian to write extensively in Latin, and is thus often dubbed the father of Latin Christianity, that is, a Christian author who writes in Latin. Of course, Christianity existed in the Latin-speaking world all the way back to the apostles Peter and Paul. After the year of 206 AD, possibly after editing anonymously the martyrdom of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, Tertullian aligned himself with the Montanist movement, which tradition would ultimately deem to be heretical, so he was wrong about that. Suspicions of heresy in this movement abounded throughout the entire movement's existence, but a definitive declaration of heresy was lacking until the 4th century. In this period of ambiguity, of whether or not this movement was heretical or not, Tertullian criticized those bishops and writers who unilaterally condemned the movement. He believed it was, at least in part, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and ultimately erred in his judgment. Pope Victor I, who reigned from 189 to 199, excommunicated the Montanist sect, severing its connection to the vine which is Christ's true church. Therefore, Tertullian's willful association with the Montanist movement was therefore blameworthy. He also did not die a martyr. He died of natural causes in 257. Saint Coromotus was a martyred bishop of Iconium in Lycaonia in Asia Minor. Saint Cyprian died in 258. He was a remarkably gifted scholar who was elected bishop of Carthage much to the chagrin of his opponent, Novatus, not the same as the Novatian who became an anti-pope as we talked about earlier. The embarrassed elder cleric, Novatus, who had felt that his seniority set himself as the clear candidate to become the next bishop of Carthage, made himself into a thorn into the side of the younger Cyprian. He criticized him for being too lax in readmitting lapses in the church, and he also criticized him for fleeing from persecution early in his reign. In reality, Cyprian, following the direction of Rome, in the form of the directions of Popes Fabian, Cornelius, Lucius I, and Stephen I, prescribed years of penance for the grave sin of apostasy, but did not deny the possibility of absolution for such sinners who fulfilled such strict forms of penance. Novatus and the anti-pope which he came to follow, Novatian, taught that absolution for certain grave sins, including apostasy, was impossible. These are all treatises of St. Cyprian. I have an entire video on St. Cyprian that you can check out if you want to dive more into his ministry. On September 13th, 258, at the order of the proconsul Galerius Maximus, St. Cyprian was questioned. He was sentenced to death by the sword, to which he responded, Deo gratias. He knelt, prayed, and blindfolded himself, and then was killed on September 14th, which is his feast day. Saints Jovinus and Basilius were martyrs of Rome whose relics are enshrined in the Via Latina. They died in 258. St. Lawrence the Deacon. According to the late medieval Golden Legend, a priest named Sixtus went on an apostolic mission to Spain, where he found two young Christian cousins, Lauren, born approximately 225, and Vincent, both raised by the devout Spaniard parents in the town of Huesca, or perhaps Valencia. Tradition holds that the saint martyrs that we've already talked about, Orencio and Paciencia, who died in 240, were Lawrence's parents. Becoming attached to the teachings of the spiritual master, Lawrence and Vincent returned with Sixtus to Rome, where they served under him. Eventually, Vincent would return to Spain, but Lawrence would stay to continue to study and serve under Father Sixtus. Regardless, in 259, Sixtus was killed after the Battle of Verona by Trajan Decius. So the previous pope was killed in the Battle of Verona. In the year 257, Sixtus II was called upon to succeed St. Peter in the office of the servant of the servants of God as the supreme pontiff. Upon his succession to the chair of St. Peter, he ordained his longtime spiritual son, St. Lawrence, as a deacon, and charged him with the administration of charitable works. Yet shortly after he began his diaconate ministry in August of 258, Emperor Valerian ordered all Christian clerics to be executed without any trial whatsoever. On August 6th, Saints Felicissimus, Agapitus, and Sixtus II all gave their lives for the Lord. Before he departed to meet the sword, which would spill his blood for Christ, Sixtus looked upon his spiritual son Lawrence and told him, "Fret not, you shall follow me in 3 days' time." Shortly after he watched his spiritual master pour out his life for the Lord, Lawrence discovered the reason that his life had been preserved. He was the master of the treasury of the Roman Church. He was called forth by the masters of Valerian's treasury and was ordered to prepare the treasures of the church to be confiscated by the emperor. Famously, Lawrence instead sold all of the wealth of the church at his disposal to supply the needs of the poor. When he was confronted by Valerian's men to hand over the church's treasures, he revealed in the many poor souls who relied on the church's charity for sustenance, telling the officials, "Behold the jewels of the church. The church is truly rich, far richer than your emperor." He was sentenced on August 10th, 258 to execution by being burnt upon a grill. After roasting for some time upon his back, he famously called out, saying, "Turn me over, I am done on this side." Or as St. Ambrose recalls it, "Turn me over, eat what is cooked if you would like." St. Cyriaca or St. Dominica. She was a wealthy Roman woman who used her wealth to protect persecuted Christians. She also used her resources and her home to assist St. Lawrence the Deacon in his ministry to the poor of Rome. Once Lawrence was martyred, she recovered his remains and had them buried on a hill which she owned. In turn, she too was martyred by being scourged to death in the late 250s. St. Agapius of Spain. He was a Spanish bishop who was martyred by being sent into exile in northern Africa, where he died due to the harsh conditions along with his holy companions. Saints Digma and Emerita. These were Roman maidens martyred in the Eternal City. They both died while praying before their judges. Saints Fructuosus, Aglorius, and Eulogius. In Tarragona, in Spain, during the reigns of Gallienus, the holy martyrs Fructuosus, who was a bishop, Aglorius, and Eulogius, deacons, were thrown into prison, and were then cast into a fire. Their bonds were burnt, they extended their arms in the form of a cross, and they consummated their martyrdom in fire while in prayer. On their anniversary, St. Augustine preached a sermon to his people, recognizing their powerful witness. Saints Marian, James, and companions died in 259. Marian was a lector, James was a deacon. They both served in northern Africa. They were martyred alongside a good deal of martyrs in northern Africa, along with their bishops. In 259, Saints Montanus, Flavian, Julius, Lucius, Victoricus, and their 5 companions all died. After Saint Cyprian was executed, the executioner reassigned. His replacement was subsequently mauled to death by a mob. A group of Christians were randomly selected to be executed in retribution. These Christians included priests and bishops, including Saint Montanus, Saint Lucius, Saint Flavian, Saint Julian, and Saint Victoricus. Before their death, Montanus encouraged the faithful of Cyprian to hold fast to the faith, anticipating their eternal rewards. Saints Alexander, Malchus, and Priscus. This is according to Alan Butler, the great saintly biographer. These eminent Christians, Priscus, Malchus, and Alexander, led a retired holy life in the country near Caesarea in Palestine. During the fury of the persecution under Valerian, they often called to mind the triumphs of the martyrs and secretly reproached themselves with cowardice, as living like soldiers who passed their time in softness and ease, while their brethren and fellow warriors bore all the heat of the battle. They could not long smother these warm sentiments in their breasts, but expressed them to one another. What, said they, while the secure gate of heaven is open, shall we shut it against ourselves? Shall we be so faint-hearted as not to suffer for the name of Christ who died for us? Our brethren invite us by their example. Their blood is a loud voice, which presses us to tread in their steps. Shall we be deaf to a cry calling us to the combat and to a glorious victory? Full of this holy ardor, they all with one mind repaired to Caesarea of their own accord, by a particular instinct of grace, presented themselves before the governor, declaring themselves Christians. While all others were struck with admiration at the sight of their generous courage, the barbarous judge appeared not able to contain his rage. After having tried on them all the tortures which he employed on other martyrs, he condemned them to be exposed to wild beasts. They are honored as saints. They died in 260 A.D. Saint Felix of Nola. Saint Felix was the son of a retired Syrian centurion who, upon his father's death, sold his inheritance to the poor and became a priest, an assistant to Bishop Maximus of Nola. During Emperor Decius' persecution, Felix was arrested and tortured, but was miraculously freed from prison by an angel to aid the fleeing Bishop Maximus. The most prominent legend states that when Felix was hiding the sick bishop, and later when hiding himself, a spider instantly spun a thick web over the entrance of their hiding places, convincing imperial soldiers that the buildings were abandoned. Felix successfully evaded capture until the persecution ended in 251 with the death of Emperor Decius. After Bishop Maximus died, Felix humbly refused to be his successor, instead promoting a more senior priest named Quintus, while he continued his priestly ministry and gave his farming income to the poor. Though he lived most of his life as a confessor, tradition eventually assigned Felix a martyr's death, either shortly after the Decian persecution or under Emperor Valerian, in 255 AD. 260, Saints Leo and Perigorius were martyred in Lycia in Asia Minor. The martyrs of Utica also gave their lives in 260. At Carthage, this is from the Roman Martyrology. At Carthage, of 300 holy martyrs in the time of Valerian and Gallienus, among other torments, the governor ordered a limicone to be lighted and live coals with incense to be set nearby. Said to these confessors of the faith, choose whether you will offer incense to Jupiter or be thrown down into lime. And they, armed with faith, confessing Christ the Son of God, with one swift impulse hurled themselves into the fire, where in the fumes of the burning lime they were reduced to powder. Hence this band of blessed ones in white raiment have been held worthy of the name White Mass. Saints Peter, Julian, and their companions were a group of martyrs put to death in 260 during the persecution of Emperors Valerian and Gallienus. The martyrs of Alexandria all gave their lives in 261. In this year, a terrible plague infected virtually every home of Alexandria. The bodies of the dead were laid in the streets unburied by families who were terrified of contracting the disease by handling their own dead. A tremendous stench therefore filled the city. This was in the midst of a persecution of Christians. Although the Christians were in hiding, their charity could not be contained. They came out of their homes to bury the bodies of the dead, to clean their wounds, and to tend to all the ill and abandoned that they could. As a result, a great number of these Christians were put to the sword for their kindness. Saint Peregrine of Auxerre. He was the first bishop of Auxerre in Gaul. He was a priest of Rome who was appointed by Pope Sixtus II to evangelize this region of Gaul, as well as to minister to the resident Christians of this area. After converting most of the inhabitants of Auxerre, he protested publicly against the construction of a new temple to Jupiter. This led to his torture and his beheading. This Peregrine is not the patron saint of cancer. That was, of course, a medieval saint. Saint Agrippina died in 262. She was a blonde-haired princess who was executed either by scourging or beheading or both. The same year, Saint Asterius of Caesarea and Saint Marinus, a Roman soldier, both gave their lives to Christ. Marinus was born to a noble family of Caesarea and enjoyed a successful military career. He was elevated to the position of centurion, but was required to offer an imperial sacrifice before receiving this promotion. He refused to do so and confessed his Christian faith. He was given 3 hours to change his mind, but when he did not, he was executed. Asterius of Caesarea was also a Roman senator, who gave a Christian burial to the Christian soldier Marinus of Caesarea. He was subsequently beheaded for burying the martyr. Saint Heraclius and Zosimus were African martyrs who suffered in Carthage in 263. In 264, Saints Cassius and Ostromoini. Saint Ostromoini was the great missionary bishop of Auvergne. He converted the Roman senator Saint Cassius as well as Victorinus, a pagan priest. Cassius and Victorinus were martyred alongside one another. Saint Anthalion, also called Anatolianus, a martyr. He is mentioned by Saint Gregory of Tours as one of the martyrs of Auvergne, France, in the reign of Emperor Valerian. Anthalion's companions were Saints Cassius, Maximus, Laminius, and Victorinus. He died in 265. Saint Antidius was a bishop and martyr, a disciple of Saint Feronius in the see of Besançon in France, sometimes called Tude. Antidius succeeded Saint Feronius as bishop. He was martyred by a band of German and barbarian marauders. Saint Dionysius was the first pope who did not die as a martyr. He was the 25th pontiff. He reigned from 259 to 268. The earliest point of Dionysius' life that we can speak of is that he served as a presbyter under Pope Stephen I in the mid-250s, though perhaps he had already been ordained before that point. He was involved in the controversy over the validity of infant baptisms and corresponded by letter with Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria on this matter. After Sixtus II was martyred, the Roman see remained vacant for a year. Valerian's ban on all Christian clergy made it imprudent to elect a successor to St. Peter, who would immediately be executed. Once the fervor of this persecution began to wane, Dionysius was elected. Later, Emperor Gallienus issued an edict of toleration which gave legal status to the church and allowed her pastors to re-enter their churches and leave the catacombs for Mass. As Pope, Dionysius condemned the doctrines of modalism by Sibelius as well as the errors of those who opposed modalism, to the point of delving into the error of tritheism, that God was 3 distinct hypostases. He even questioned his old friend Dionysius of Alexandria in his treatise against Sibelius, accusing him perhaps of tritheism, but he ultimately accepted Alexandrian's apologia as orthodox. Dionysius oversaw charitable works for the Christians in Syria and Cappadocia. Again, he is the first pope who did not die a martyr. Saint Zama died in 268. He is the first recorded bishop of Bologna, Italy. He was ordained by Pope Saint Dionysius and was entrusted with the founding of this illustrious see. Saint Theodosius died in 269. With Lucius, Mark, and Peter, members of the group of 50 soldier martyrs who were put to death at Rome during the reign of Claudius for their Christian faith. Saint Valentine. He was a presbyter of Rome, and was perhaps the former bishop of Terni, who died to self and ministered to persecuted Christians, although this obviously exposed himself to the penalties of those he served. Famously, when the emperor decreed that no soldier could be married, it is said that Valentine continued to marry Roman soldiers, risking his life to witness to the importance of the vocation of matrimony. When questioned, "Why, Valentine, do you want to be a friend of our enemies and reject our friendship?" the saint replied to the emperor, "My lord, if you knew the gift of God, you would be happy together with your empire, and would reject the worship of idols and you would worship the true God and his Son Jesus Christ." To put him to the test, he was asked to heal the sight of a blind girl, and he did just that. He then earned the respect of Emperor Claudius, until he continued to implore the emperor to convert. For pushing him, he was beheaded. Emperor Aurelian also persecuted Christians from 270 to 275. Saint Aurea gave her life for Christ in 270. She was born of noble blood. Due to her Christian faith, she was exiled to Ostia rather than being executed. She was put in house arrest, but kept up communication with the faithful and the bishop there. She worked a number of miracles in her exile. A prisoner came to her for comfort at one point, and his chains were widened as a result, allowing him to escape if he wished. The guards observed this, and each one of them were converted, leading to their execution. Ultimately, she was asked to offer idols, giving her an ultimatum between life and death. She chose life, that is, eternal life, by refusing to sacrifice to idols, and she was cast into the sea to her death. Saint Patroclus was martyred in 275. He was a wealthy aristocrat who lived in a rural estate outside of Tricastinum in Gaul. There he was content to live a pious and holy life, devoting himself to prayer and works of charity. During the persecution of Aurelian, he was beheaded. Saint Gregory Thaumaturgus died in 270 as well. He was born to a pagan family in 213 in Neo-Caesarea. His title, Thaumaturgus, translates to wonder worker. However, the hagiographical tradition emphasizes his writings more than his miracles. His writings provide us with the best glimpses into the teaching style of Origen. He also published a work, because he was taught by Origen, he also published a work detailing the specific church governance of Caesarea after Gothic invasion, and he also articulated his Trinitarian faith. Gregory and his brother, Athenodoros, were first introduced to Christianity at age 15 after the death of their father. They both gave themselves over to their Christian studies, which took them to the Roman region of Palestine. There they became acquainted with Origen, who taught there during this time. While he intended on practicing law after studying Origen for some time, he was elected the bishop of Caesarea, and he reigned over this see for 40 years. Tradition asserts that Caesarea went from having 17 Christians at the beginning of his reign to having only 17 pagans at its conclusion. Alexander the Charcoal Burner. This saint, who died in 274, was a humble, faithful man who took up the work of a charcoal burner as a form of penance and an extinguisher of his pride. He was often, therefore, exceptionally dirty. Hagiography often deems him also to be a philosopher, either due to his formal training or to his keen insights. It is much more likely the latter, seeing that he did work as, once again, a charcoal burner. St. Gregory Thaumaturgus was summoned to Comana to select a new bishop amongst their priests for them. He found all to be objectionable, that is, until one man in the crowd scornfully suggested that he pick Alexander Carbonarius. Upon learning of this man, the charcoal burner, Gregory realized he was the one that God was choosing as their bishop. Ultimately, he would die by being burned to death for his faith. Saint Heliodorus was a martyr with companions in Pamphylia who died in 270. Saints Honestus and Saturninus died also in 270. Honestus was a disciple of Saturninus of Toulouse, one of the so-called apostles of Gaul sent by St. Fabian. He himself evangelized in Spain alongside his companion Saturninus. Honestus was martyred in Spain, while Saturninus ultimately died in Toulouse by being dragged by bulls throughout the city. Saints Marius, Martha, Adefox, and Abicum. Marius and Martha migrated from Persia with their 2 sons to Rome. There they risked their lives by giving the Christian martyrs proper burials. For this, the entire family was put on trial, and all were executed for their faith. In 270. St. Paul and Juliana. When the Roman Emperor Aurelian visited Ptolemais, Paul approached him and made the sign of the cross in front of his face. He was put on trial, and during this trial he boldly confessed his faith. He was then tortured. When Juliana observed this, she condemned the cruelty of the Roman emperor, and she joined him in his tortures. Quadratus, Acacius, and Stratonicus all converted at the sight of their faith, and these soldiers were each immediately executed. Paul and Juliana were continually tortured as the pagans hoped to solicit their apostasy. Juliana was even sent to a brothel to be defiled, but God's grace protected her chastity. Both were ultimately beheaded. Saints Mamas, Theodotus, Rufina, and Ammias. Theodotus and Rufina were the parents of Mamas, Christians in Paphlagonia, in Asia Minor. Theodotus and Rufina were imprisoned for their faith in Caesarea and were sentenced to be tortured and executed. Answering their prayers, both died peacefully, or as peacefully as possible, while in prison, awaiting their execution. Rufina also gave birth to a premature son, Mammas. A wealthy Christian widow named Ammias gave Theodotus and Rufina Christian burials and raised Mammas as her own. Eager to develop both his spiritual and natural capabilities, Ammias sent Mammas to grammar school. There he succeeded in converting many of his classmates. As a result, the governor Democritus sent him to Emperor Aurelius to be tried. He did not want the blood of the adopted son of the illustrious noblewoman's life on his hands. When before the emperor, Mammas mocked the insanity of worshipping idols straight to his face. He was then tortured, but according to the legend, he was able to escape his imprisonment by the help of God, and lived for some time in a poor hermitage in the mountains. There he devoted himself to helping his neighbors. He was eventually found and arrested, however. When the beast would not devour him, he was pierced through with a pagan priest's trident. Saint Restituta of Sora died in 271. Restituta was aided by an angel to escape the persecution of Emperor Aurelian. As she fled, she worked a miracle to heal a boy of leprosy and converted many souls in so doing. Ultimately, she was captured, arrested, and then beheaded. Saint Agapitus. He was a 16-year-old who was a son of a noble Anicia family of Palestrina, Italy. He was arrested and martyred for his faith, still before the prime of his life in 272. Saint Anastasius Cornicularius in 274. He was an officer in the Roman legion, a Cornicularius, charged with the administrative oversight of military affairs under the rule of Emperor Aurelian. Moved by the bold witness of the young martyr Saint Agapitus, he declared, "The God of Agapitus is my God." For this confession he was immediately arrested, and so shortly after faith was born in his heart, he suffered martyrdom in the year 274 near modern Palestrina. Saint Julia of Troyes was a Christian native of Troyes in Gaul. She was taken captive by the army of Emperor Aurelian and given as a slave to a Roman soldier named Claudius. By her patient witness and bold confession of the faith, she converted Claudius to Christ. When the imperial command demanded their apostasy, both Julia and Claudius refused, and they were beheaded for the faith around the year 272. Their relics were gathered and enshrined at the convent of Jorar Abbey near Meaux. Saint Priscus. Saint Priscus, a martyr, this is from the Roman Martyrology, who after having had his body pierced all over with daggers was beheaded. He died in 272. Saint Reverianus also died in 272. He was of Italian origin, and he was called by Pope Felix I to evangelize the Aedui in Gaul. He and his companion Paul, along with 10 catechists, preached the gospel amidst the heathen, and stirred the ire of Emperor Aurelian. Under his orders, Reverianus and his companions were summoned before the tribunal, and beheaded about the year 273, near the village now called Saint Reverien, named after himself. A small cell was erected over their tombs in the 4th century, and the martyr's relics, though now mostly lost, save for a fragment of his skull, remain the central focus of this pilgrimage site. As you can see, he is numbered amongst the head carriers of the Gaulish martyrs. Saint Agape was a martyr and a follower of Saint Valentine. She died in 273. She belonged to a group of virgins started by Saint Valentine. A church in Terni was dedicated to her until the 12th century, and she is listed in early martyrologies. Saints Lucilian, Paula, Claudius, Dionysius, Hypatius, and Paul all died in 273. Lucilian was a pagan priest during the reign of Aurelian. As an old man, however, he became convinced of the falseness of this religion and became a member of Christ's church. He was turned in by a group of Jews to the Roman prefect Silvanus after much success in evangelization. He was commanded to return to his pagan cult, but when he refused, his jaw was broken and he was severely otherwise tortured. Imprisoned, he joined the above companions. Paula was a young woman who witnessed the execution of all of these saints. This led her to dedicate herself to the suffering martyrs. She too was martyred for her act of charity. Saints Saturnius, Castellus, Magnus, and Lucius. These saints were disciples of the Valentine of Terni in the city of Terni in Italy that we've already discussed. They confessed Christ and refused to renounce their faith in the face of persecution. Through their witness, they attained the crown of martyrdom around the year 273. Fittingly, they are celebrated on February 15th, one day after the traditional feast day of St. Valentine. St. Columba of Sens. She was born to a noble pagan family around 257 in Galicia, Spain. She traveled all the way to Gaul to escape the darkness of pagan culture. She settled in Sens, unaware that Emperor Aurelian was currently present there. Seeing her, Aurelian sought her out to marry his son. She refused, however, for she had made vows of consecrated virginity. As a result, she was executed at Sens. Pope Felix I. As Felix ascended the papal throne, a report reached Rome that Paul of Samosata had been deposed from the See of Antioch for his monarchist views, the view that God is one indivisible hypostasis, or one person, and adoptionism, that the idea that Jesus was the perfect man and was simply adopted into the Godhead rather than him being consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father. Monarchism and adoptionism were fiercely opposed by the best of the 2nd and 3rd century theologians. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen of Alexandria all opposed these two Trinitarian heresies. Arianism might be seen as a sort of attempt to reach a truth is somewhere in the middle sort of compromise between the monarchist and Trinitarian position. And in general, I don't like that attitude of truth is somewhere in the middle of opposing sides. Sometimes it is, very often truth is in fact one of the two sides. Besides being a pope during this episcopal crisis, little is known about Felix's papacy. The Liber Pontificalis does regard him as a martyr. Saints Conan and Conan. Saint Conan of Iconium and his son Conan were monastics in Asia Minor during the reign of Emperor Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275. The father, a widower, entered a monastery and lived in ascetic devotion. His son, a deacon, followed him into this new state in life. When the persecuting governor demanded sacrifice to the gods, both refused and confessed their faith in Christ. They were then placed on red-hot cots, drenched in oil, and were suspended upside down, and were finally sawed in two. By divine preservation they endured until their souls departed by the sign of the cross which they made, and an earthquake struck the pagan temples and were destroyed in that city. Their relics were hidden in the monastic house where they had dwelt. And they both gave their lives for Christ in the year 275. Joining them in martyrdom was Saint Philomenus. He was a Christian baker of Ancria in Galatia who bore witness to Christ during the reign of Emperor Aurelian. He was reported to a judge for confessing his faith, and when he refused to offer sacrifices to idols, he was cruelly tortured. Nails were driven into his hands, feet, and head, and he was forced to walk until he died from the loss of blood from these nails. Saint Trophimus of Arles was one of the 7 bishops sent by Saint Fabian to preach the gospel and govern the church in Gaul. The churches in Gaul. Trophimus was sent to establish and govern the church of Arles. Some medieval traditions assert that he was the same as the Trophimus mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, as being a companion of St. Paul. That would either be quite the lifespan, or else would be a conflation which caused some to date the founding of the Church of Arles to the 1st century, rather than with the missionary group of bishops sent out by St. Fabian in the middle of the 3rd. He did not die as a martyr. St. Maximus of Alexandria. Bishop Maximus was the bishop, or the pope, of Alexandria, who guided the church there while Bishop Dionysius, his predecessor, endured exile during the persecutions there. After the repose of Dionysius, Maximus was chosen to occupy the Cathedra of Alexandria. He took part in the Synod of Antioch, which condemned the heresies of Paul of Samosata, the bishop of Antioch. Bishop Maximus himself died peacefully in the year 282, and the designation of pope does not indicate a rivaling claim for supremacy of the church. The term pope simply is a Latin term for father, and so it is applied to the Patriarch of Alexandria, just as an honorary title, but it does not come with the office of being the supreme head of the church. Saint Anatolius of Laodicea. Anatolius was a bishop, a saint, as well as a master theologian. He died in 283. The saint first entered public fame by working effectively as a senator in Alexandria. He was a learned man and a master of arithmetic, geometry, physics, rhetoric, dialectics, and astronomy. As a result, he managed an Aristotelian school in Alexandria, and he taught the famous Neoplatonist pagan philosopher Iamblichus. He wrote 10 books on arithmetic known as The Introduction to Arithmetic. An excerpt from his text is as follows. He said, 4 is called the just number due to the square being equal to its perimeter. For example, 4 times 4 equals 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. Of the numbers lesser than 4, the perimeter of the square is greater than the area, while of those greater, the perimeter is lesser than the area. End quote. When he traveled to Laodicea, he was welcomed by the Christians there and was ultimately made their bishop. He created a revolutionary new lunar cycle which repeated every 19 years. He did not die as a martyr. Saints Cosmas and Damian were referred to as the unmercenaries. They were native to Asia Minor. Their pagan father died while they were very little, leaving them to be raised by their mother Theodota. She raised them in sanctity by her example and through reading pious texts to them. They grew to be skilled physicians who aided their natural talents with supernatural faith and prayer. They also treated animals. Out of their abundant piety, they took a vow to always work for free. However, after healing a woman who all counted as already dead, Damian accepted her gift of 3 eggs, which she told him were being made in honor of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Heartbroken that his brother had broken their vow to receive payment for a healing, the 2 brothers broke off from one another until their deaths. Upon dying, Cosmas asked, as his final request, that his brother Damian not be buried beside him, so ashamed was he that his brother had accepted payment. Once Damian died, however, a camel spoke and told the people that it was in fact the will of God that the 2 be buried together, and that he did not accept the gift of eggs out of greed, but only out of respect for the Holy Trinity. Saints Diodorus and Marianus died in 283. Diodorus was a priest in Rome during the persecution of Christians under Emperor Numerian in 283, when a cave near the execution site of other martyrs became a gathering place for Christians to celebrate the Holy Mass. The authorities sealed its entrance, and those within, among whom were Diodorus and Marianus, received the crown of martyrdom after a long and agonizing death of starvation. Saints Justus and Abundius were Christians in Spain who, in the same year, were executed under the reign of Emperor Numerian and the prefect Alibrius. They were cast into the flames for their faith, but the fire did not claim their lives. Having escaped unharmed from the trial by fire, they were struck with the sword and thus attained their crown of martyrdom. They are remembered on December 14th. St. Pelagius of Constance. He was born to a wealthy Christian family in Pannonia on the edge of the Roman Empire, north of Albania and Serbia. He endured severe torture and was martyred for his faith as a young man. He was an ordained deacon. In 284, Saints Chrysanthus, Daria, and Claudius all gave their lives for Christ. Chrysanthus was the sole son of an Egyptian patrician named Polemus or Polion. During the reign of Numerian, Chrysanthus was educated in Rome after his father moved there. He was repulsed by the excesses of pagan lifestyle, which he was being initiated into, which led him to become a member of Christ's church through baptism. His father attempted to dissuade him from his Christian faith by wedding him to Daria, who was either a Vestal virgin or a Roman priestess to Minerva. Regardless, he converted her, and they chose to live celibate lives. They converted numerous other souls. For this they were tried and tortured. Their constancy led to the conversion of about 70 soldiers, as well as Claudius and his family, a Roman tribune who had apprehended them. All of these were converted. Claudius's family was entirely killed, and Chrysanthus and Daria soon followed. Saint Hilarius of Aquileia and their companions all died in 284 as well. Hilarius was the second bishop of Aquileia. He succeeded Hermagoras. He was arrested and put to death, but before he was executed, he prayed for the collapse of the local pagan temples, and these were each destroyed. His deacon Tatianus and his companions Felix, Largus, and Dionysius were all martyred together. The same year, Saint Maximilian of Chelea gave his life for Christ. Saint Maximilian was born in the town of Celia, in what is now modern Slovenia, into a wealthy family. After the early death of his parents, he distributed his goods to the poor, freed his household slaves, and set out for Rome. There he received his mission and was sent north to Noricum, in the region between modern Austria and Slovenia, where he founded the church of Lariacum, Lorc, and served as its bishop. In the reign of the Emperor Numerian, a persecution broke out in Noricum as well as across the empire. Bishop Maximilian refused to sacrifice to idols and to abandon his episcopal witness. He was seized, brought before the prefect, and beheaded outside of his native town around the year 284. Saint Thalius died the same year. He was born to a noble family in the region of Lebanon in the 3rd century. He trained as a physician and gave himself freely to the care of the sick, becoming known for his mercy and charity. When persecutions arose, he fled to Cilicia and hid near Anazarbus, yet was eventually arrested and brought before the governor at Agay. Enduring many torments, including being cast into the sea, fed to beasts, and hanged upside down, he confessed Christ boldly. Finally, he was beheaded about the year 284 and received the crown of martyrdom. His relics were honored, and miracles were reported at the resting place. Saints Victorinus and Companions. These 7 martyrs, this comes from the Acts of Saint Victorinus and Companions, translated by Monsignor Stephen Asamanin. I'm going to read just excerpts from that text. We read, "These 7 martyrs were citizens of Corinth, and confessed their faith before Tertius the proconsul in their own country in 249, in the beginning of the reign of Decius. After their torments they passed into Egypt, whether by compulsion or by voluntary banishment is not known, and there finished their martyrdom at Diospolis, capital of Thebes, in the reign of Numerian in 284 under the governor Sabinus. After the governor had tried the constancy of the martyrs by racks, scourges, and various inventions of cruelty, he caused Victorinus to be thrown into a great mortar. The executioners began by pounding his feet and legs, saying to him at every stroke, 'Spare yourself, wretch. It depends upon you to escape this death, if only you will renounce your new God.' The prefect grew furious at his constancy and at length commanded his head to be beat to pieces. The sight of this mortar, so far from casting a damp on his companions, seemed to inspire them with the greater ardor to be treated in like manner, so that when the tyrant threatened Victor with the same death, he only desired him to hasten the execution, and pointing to the mortar, said, 'In that is salvation and true felicity prepared for me.' He was immediately cast into it and beaten to death in the mortar." If you're not aware of what a mortar is, imagine like I think people do it for like making guacamole. We don't really grind our own, grain anymore in the modern day. But you can see it here. You would big old marble bowl, and they would use something really heavy to grind their body parts. Nicephorus, the 3rd martyr, was impatient of delay and leaped up of his own accord into the bloody mortar. The judge, enraged at his boldness, commanded not one but many executioners at once to pound him in the same manner. He caused Claudian IV to be chopped in pieces and his bleeding joints to be thrown at the feet of those who were yet living. He expired after his feet, hands, arms, legs, and thighs were cut off. The tyrant, pointing to his mangled limbs and scattered bones, said to the other 3, "It concerns you to avoid this punishment. I do not compel you to suffer." The martyrs answered with one voice, "On the contrary, we rather pray that if you have any other more exquisite torment, you would inflict it on us. We are determined never to violate the fidelity which we owe to God, or to deny Jesus Christ our Savior, for he is our God, from whom we have our being, and to whom alone we aspire." The tyrant became almost distracted with fury, and commanded Diodorus to be burned alive, Serapion to be beheaded, and Papias to be drowned. Saint Costolus died a martyr in 286. He was the chamberlain of Emperor Diocletian. And so here we begin the Diocletian martyrs, the greatest persecutor of Christianity in the entire Roman in antiquity. He was the chamberlain of Diocletian, and he sheltered Christians in his own home and arranged for religious services inside the imperial palace itself. Because of his activity in bringing converts to Pope St. Caius to be baptized after he was captured, he was captured, tortured, and put to death. His feast day is March 26th. We're still going to see martyrs, not from Diocletian, though, because Diocletian co-reigned at first with another Roman emperor. In 286, Saints Crispin and Crispian were also martyred. These 2 brothers were born to a wealthy Roman family and devoted their lives to preaching to the Gauls. Imitating St. Paul, they sustained their missionary efforts by making shoes during the night. They converted many who came to shop at their shoe shop. In 285, Diocletian sent his victor Maximian Herculeus to Gaul to massacre the Theban legion, the sole Christian legion of the entire military. He discovered the effective ministry of the brothers on his way to accomplish this wicked quest. Crispin and Crispian were arrested, they were suspended by pulleys and then struck with clubs. Their hands were tied tight with wires and their flesh was scourged from their backs. They prayed the entire time. After the weapons of the torturers miraculously turned against them, they were tied to millstones and thrown into the river, but were able to escape and swim away. They were then thrust into a hotbed of fire, but were not consumed, for they sang songs of praise to God. Finally, they were beheaded, and an abbey was erected on the site of their imprisonment. Begin now reading about the saints that were related to the hagiography of Saint Sebastian. I have an entire video on Saint Sebastian if you want to dive more in depth into this story. Saints Marcus and Marcellianus were two saints. They were twin brothers of an illustrious family of Rome. They converted during their youth, and they did embrace the vocation of matrimony. They were exposed as Christians, although they were members of the military, and were arrested under Diocletian. Their friends delayed their execution and hoped that they would eventually renounce their faith. Their pagan parents begged them to renounce their faith, and their wives and their baby children did as well. Saint Sebastian, however, visited them daily. He was also a military man and a faithful Christian, and he encouraged them to stay strong in their resolution. Ultimately, their father Tranquillinus and their mother Marcia, their wives, and also one of the Roman officials named Nicostratus, all converted as a result of both Marcus and Marcellianus' faith, but also the wonders worked by Saint Sebastian during their interactions. Later, Chromatius, the judge, was also converted. Ultimately, all of these men died as martyrs. Marcus and Marcellianus were impaled with lances. Saint Piotin died in 286. He was a native of Benevento, Italy. He was sent to evangelize to the cities of Chartres in modern France and Tournai in modern Belgium. He was ordained by Saint Denis, the head carrier, whom we spoke about earlier. He was martyred by having the top of his skull sliced off. Saint Regina was a virgin martyr born to Clement, a Gaulish pagan. Her mother died at childbirth, and she was placed under the care of a Christian nurse who had her baptized. Regina grew up as a shepherdess. In the fields, she loved to speak with God and meditate upon the lives of the saints, as we are now. At age 15, she was betrothed to a proconsul named Olybrius, but refused to renounce Christianity as he required. For this, he had her tortured and beheaded. Some regard her as a Decian martyr of 251, although Gaul was more established in the faith by the persecution of Maximian in 286, making this later dating more likely in my opinion. Saint Maurice and the Holy Theban Legion martyrs. The Theban Legion was an Egyptian legion of 6,666 soldiers who professed the Christian faith. The legion was a garrison unit in Thebes, Egypt. Emperor Maximian, however, ordered them to march to Gaul to assist in a rebellion in Burgundy. The commanders of the legion included Saints Maurice, Canditus, Innocent, and Exuperius. Saints Victor and Ursus were also among their number. The legion was also commanded by Emperor Maximian to harass Christians. According to the Golden Legend, the commander Canditus said, quote, "We are your soldiers, but we are also servants of the true God. We cannot renounce him who is our creator and master, and also yours, even though you reject him." In Agunum, later named Saint Maurice after one of the leaders of the Theban Legion, Switzerland, the legion was ordered to offer sacrifice to pagan idols. They refused, and for this they were slaughtered on 2 separate occasions. The blood of nearly 7,000 men was spilled. Saint Zoe was a Roman noblewoman who was married to a high Roman official named Nicostratus. She was mute for 6 years, but when Nicostratus questioned Saint Sebastian in the same account that we spoke about earlier, the saint miraculously healed her by making the sign of the cross over her. This caused both her conversion and that of her husband. She lived the rest of her life in devotion to Saint Peter, whose tomb she hardly left. She was eventually executed by being suspended over a fire, thus dying of asphyxiation from the smoke. Saint Crescentian died in 287. He was a martyred soldier beheaded at Saldo, near Città di Castello in Italy. Saint Faith, or Fides, was a girl who died in Aquitaine in southern Gaul, either in 287 or perhaps in the early 4th century. She was arrested for her refusal to offer sacrifice to the pagan idols. She was tortured with a red-hot brazier and thus killed. Saint Paul Matius was an imperial consul whose position of influence did not spare him from the pain of the sword for his faith. He was martyred along with his wife and children and a total of 42 members of his household in 287. Saint Quintin was the son of a Roman senator named Zeno. He traveled to Gaul to evangelize alongside Lucian, who was subsequently martyred. Quintin went on to preach in Amiens and gained a reputation as a wonder worker. The Roman prefect Rictiavaros arrested him while traveling throughout the region. He was manacled and tortured, but refused to renounce his faith. He was ultimately beheaded and thrown into the marshes. Saint Sabinus was a Roman procurator in Hermopolis, Egypt, and was possibly also the bishop of this region. He hid himself along with a number of other Christians at Diocletian's persecutions as they began. However, their hiding place was revealed to the government by one who pretended to be a beggar who approached them for alms. They were taken to Antinoüs to be tortured. Ultimately, Sabinus was thrown into the Nile River to be drowned. In 287. The same year, St. Valerius and Rufinus died. They were also sent to evangelize to northern Gaul. They settled in a town called Soissons. They fled from persecution to a cave in a woodland area. They were discovered, beaten, tortured, and beheaded. Saints Victoricus, Fustian, and Gentian, all headbearers, as you can see in this image. Victoricus and Fustian were missionaries sent from Rome to Therion to the people known as the Morini. Quintin, Crispin, and Crispian were originally their partners in this mission. Gentian tried to warn them of the persecution, and because he warned them, he was beheaded as well. Ultimately, they were discovered and beheaded, and they joined the many Gaulish cephalophores saints. According to the Gulgen legend, they took spears of iron and put them through their ears and through their nostrils and had them decapitated. And by the will and power of our Lord, they arose up and took their heads in their hands and bare them 2 miles far from the place where they had been beheaded. Saint Sebastian lived from 257 to 288. He was born to Christians in Narbonum in Gaul in 260. He received his education near Milan. Around 280, he entered the Praetorian Guard. He kept his Christian faith a secret so that he could be of service to imprisoned Christians in the dungeons of the emperor. Eventually, he rose to a position of prominence in the Imperial Guard, which he could not have anticipated as he served this ministry. Despite this worldly favor, Sebastian was not afraid to throw away all of his worldly progress and even his life on this world in order to serve Christians who were tempted to recant their faith. Under the co-reigning emperors Diocletian and Maximian, who reigned together from 284 to 305, 2 Christian brothers, Marcellinus and Mark, as we talked about earlier, were arrested and sentenced to execution. When he heard that they were beginning to waver in their resolution due to the cheerful entreaties of their parents, wives, and children, he said to them, O right noble knights of Jesu Christ, wise and hardy, which be come to the victory and now go back. And for a few blandishing words, vain and miserable, you will lose the victory permanable. Lose ye not the everlasting life for the blandishing words of women. Be ye example to other Christian men, for to be strong in the faith. End quote. After this, St. Sebastian was accused to the emperor that he was Christian, wherefore Diocletian, the emperor of Rome, made him come before him, and said to him, I have always loved thee well, and have made thee master of my palace. How then hast thou been Christian privily against my health, and in despite of our gods? St. Sebastian responded to Diocletian, Always I have worshipped Jesu Christ for thy health, and for the state of Rome, and I think for to pray and demand help of the idols of stone is a great folly. With these words Diocletian was much angry and wroth, and commanded him to be led to the field, and there to be bounden to a stake for to be shot at. And the archer shot at him till he was as full of arrows as an urchin is full of pricks, and thus left him there for dead. He survived, however, and was necessarily stoned to death, to finally end his heroic race. Saints Donatian and Rogatian died in 290. The 5th century Passion of the Children of Dantes records the martyrdom account of these 2 young saints. Donatian and Rogatian were the sons of the first magistrate of Nantes. Donatian was baptized by Saint Similian, the 3rd bishop of Nantes. The first Christian church of Nantes was in their familial estate. The 2 boys were put on trial. When they refused to offer incense to idols, they were severely beaten and sentenced to be killed the following day. As the 2 prayed, Rogatian mourned that he should die without baptism. His brother affirmed him that he would be baptized in the desire for Christ, evident in his blood. They were pierced through, and then beheaded. Saint Nestor was a saint and a public performer, a wrestler of Thessaloniki. When the gladiator Laius made fame by mocking Christians as he slaughtered them, Nestor sought permission to challenge him in the arena from his bishop. He was given that position, and he did just that, and after he slayed Laius, he himself was struck down by the emperor's orders with his own sword. He died in 290. Saints Firmus and Rusticus also died in 290. These 2 martyrs were native to Bergamo, and they came from wealthy families. Firmus was first captured and sent to Milan for judgment. On his way, his relative Rusticus greeted him, and he too was sent along with him. In Milan, they were given the chance to offer sacrifice to idols. When they did not, they were tortured, beaten, and beheaded. Saints Hermes and Adrian. Hermes and Adrian were leaders of a group of 24 Christians who were martyred in 290. Their witness was praised later by St. Augustine, indicating that they had a large influence on the faith throughout northern Africa, including Hippo. St. Justin Was a small child at Laveur, France. He might be identical with Justus of Beauvais. He died in 290. St. Lucien of Beauvais. Lucian established the Diocese of Beauvais as a missionary bishop. He preached alongside his two disciples, Maximian and Julian, who gave their lives alongside him. He originally hailed from a noble family in Rome. Some traditions regard him to have been baptized by Peter and ordained by Clement. Most, however, regard this as incorrect. Later documents record him as being a companion of St. Quentin, whom we discussed. He is also regarded as a companion of St. Denis, the first head carrier. St. Paul of Thebes. He is known by tradition as the first hermit. He is sometimes called Paul the Anchorite, indicating that he bound himself to a particular hermitage, most likely a cave. He was born in 227 in rural Egypt. His parents died when he was young, leaving him to take care of his sister. His brother-in-law knew of his faith and intended on turning him over to authorities so that he could gain his inheritance. This caused Paul to flee into the desert around the year 250. God provided for his material needs by giving him clothing from the leaves of the palm trees, fruit to eat, and ravens brought him 1 loaf of bread a day. He remained in the desert until he passed the age of 100. He would later serve as a mentor to St. Anthony of the Desert. He died in the middle of the 4th century, and he did not die as a martyr. I should not have made this one red. St. Pompeius was a bishop of Pavia. He possibly suffered at the hands of Roman officials during the persecutions of the church in the late 3rd century, but is not listed as a martyr officially. St. Repsime, Guyana, and their companions. These virgins fled the persecution of Christians to head for the Christian kingdom of Armenia. Repsimia was outwardly quite beautiful, but even more so in her soul. She was sought out by Diocletian's servants to be amongst his wives. They sent him a portrait, and he desired her greatly. As she had consecrated her virginity to Christ, however, she fled to Armenia along with her fellow nuns. They endured great trials on their journey. Diocletian heard of their fleeing and sent word to the king of Armenia, Tiridates, to either return her to Rome or to marry her himself. Tiridates decided on the latter option. When she refused, he resolved to slaughter all of the nuns, but she turned herself in to spare her sisters' lives. In Tiridates' chamber, she was given a miraculous strength to defeat him in his attempts to force himself upon her. She then escaped the palace. The next day, however, she had her tongue removed, and she was burned with candles. She had her eyes and her limbs cut off as well, and her fellow sisters were similarly murdered because of the lust of the king of what was supposed to have already become a Christian nation since the preaching of St. Bartholomew. St. Serena of Rome is regarded as the first wife of Diocletian before he reached the pinnacle of Roman politics. She kept her Christian faith a secret from her husband and was martyred as soon as he learned of it. St. Victor of Marseille. Victor was a Roman officer at Marseille who publicly renounced the worship of idols. His trial sent him to Maximian himself, where he was racked, beaten, and dragged through the streets. He was then thrown in prison, and he converted 3 other soldiers, Longinus, Alexander, and Felician. Each of them were beheaded. Victor was then brought before an idol of Jupiter. He kicked it to the ground. He was then to be killed with a millstone, but the millstone broke before him, and he was finally beheaded. St. Vincent of Agan died also in 292. He was a deacon in Gaul who was arrested after disrupting a pagan ritual. He was executed by being stretched out on the ground and impaled with 4 stakes. He was then scourged and then beheaded. St. Aquilina. She died as a child martyr. She was from Byblos, modern-day Lebanon. Her parents raised her in the faith, and she was catechized directly by her bishop. She persuaded a pagan friend to convert at age 12. She was then brought before Governor of Eleusis, where she confessed her faith and said that she would never renounce Jesus. She was then tortured, stripped, flogged, impaled through the air with hot rods, and thrown to be eaten by dogs. She survived, however, and returned into the city to renounce the governor for his wickedness. She was sentenced to be beheaded, but she died before this could take place while in prison. St. Archelaus, Thecla, and Susanna all died in 293. These 3 virgins lived an ascetic monastic way of life in Rome. During Diocletian's persecution, they moved to the region of Campania disguised as men. They settled in a remote area where they could live out their vocations. Eventually, they were brought before the governor of the region. He sentenced them to be devoured by lions, but the lions would not eat them. The lions were then executed. The nuns were then racked and opened up with iron utensils, and hot tar was poured into their wounds. They were then to be killed with a huge stone, but the stone turned on the executioners instead. Eventually, they were beheaded. Saint Carpophoros and his companions were each murdered in 295. These soldiers were either deserters of the original Theban legion or were imprisoned Christian soldiers who were freed by the Christian guard Saint Carpophoros. They were martyred together as they made their way north, escaping the wrath of Diocletian. Saint Maximilian of Tebessa died in 295. He was the son of Fabius Victor, an official who served in the Roman army. Maximilian was obliged to enlist at age 21, but he objected not to, as many Christians, after the slaughter of the Theban legion, conscientiously objected from any service in the Roman military. He was then brought before Cassius Dio, the proconsul of Africa, to be forced to swear allegiance to the emperor as a soldier. He refused, stating that a Christian could not in good conscience serve in Diocletian's military, and he was beheaded on the spot. Saints Maximus, Alexander Claudius, Cutias, and Priapictigna. We know nothing of these saints except for their names, and that they were martyred together under Diocletian in 295. Saints Rufus and Carpophoros, we talked about them already. Oh no, we didn't talk about them. This blurb comes from Catholic.org about them. They were put to death at Capua, Italy, during the persecutions of Emperor Diocletian. Rufus was supposedly a deacon and not a bishop, although he is considered the same person as Saint Rufus, listed in the pre-1970 Roman Martyrology as the Bishop of Capua. Carpophoros is unknown. This is a separate Carpophoros than the one we just discussed. Saints Terpetius, Gabinius, and Susanna all died in 295. Terpetius was the son of Chromatius, the Roman prefect whom Saint Sebastian converted, as we talked about earlier. He was also baptized as his father was, and Saint Sebastian served as his godfather. He was then executed during the reign of Diocletian, perhaps as early as 286. Susanna was the daughter of a pious and noble father, Saint Gabinius. Gabinius was the brother of Pope Caius, and a relative of Diocletian himself. Both this holy father and his daughter were beheaded in their homes. Perhaps not to draw public shame to Diocletian for executing his own family, he did it quietly in their homes. The two saints are paired with Saint Terpetius because they share a feast day on August 11th, although they did not know each other in this life. Saint Gaius the Pope, who reigned from 283 to 296, the 28th Pope. He was born in the city of Salona or Solon in Italy. The historical record is unclear as to whether or not he is the same as the Caius who formed the Church of Salona, establishing a church in his home along with his brother Gabinus before being elevated to the throne of St. Peter. As Pope, he decreed that bishops must first serve in lower ecclesiastical offices before being elected Pope. He also divided Rome into various districts, giving each district the pastoral care of a particular bishop, so that parishioners could receive more regular pastoral care from a bishop. He built new churches and expanded cemeteries even during the persecution of Diocletian, expanding the church's influence over the Eternal City. Diocletian's wrath forced Caius to dwell and celebrate the liturgy in the catacombs until he was eventually martyred in 296. In 297, Saints Octavius, Salutor, and Adventor were also martyred. They were Roman soldiers and are the patron saints of Turin, Italy. They might have been associated with the Theban legion. 297, Saint Romanos of Samosata also gave her life with her companions. His life with his companions, His companions were Jacob, Philippius, Hipparchus, Abibus, Julianus, and Peragorius. Each of these were Syrian martyrs who were tortured for their faith by being hung from trees and being nailed to them. Saint Ananias III was the martyr priest of Phoenicia of modern Lebanon. In prison, Ananias converted a man named Peter as well as 7 guards, and they each shared in his martyrdom. Saint Marcellus the Centurion and Saint Cassian died in 298. Marcellus was a Roman centurion stationed in Tingis in Morocco. He refused to take part in the birthday celebrations of the Roman emperor as he did not want to take part in any idolatrous services. As a result, he was brought before a judge who passed him to be sentenced by Aurelius Agricolianus, who did not favor Christians. He was then executed by the sword. Afterwards, Saint Cassian refused to write down these events, although he was the official scribe of this faction of the Roman military, and for refusing to do his duty because of his disgust, he too was martyred. Saints Timothy and Mara died in 298. Timothy came from the village of Parapa in Egypt. He was the son of a Catholic priest. He was ordained a lector, and thus his job was to protect the sacred books from the edict of Diocletian that all Christian books were to be destroyed. When he refused to turn these books over to the Roman official, 2 red-hot pokers were shoved inside of his ears, all the way behind his eyes, causing him to go blind. He was then hung upside down with a heavy stone tied to his neck. His wife was then brought before him to persuade him to recant, but when she joined him in boldly professing Christ, her hair was pulled from her head, and her fingers were cut off. She thanked the governor for helping her to pay the just penalty due for her sins, and for helping her to earn an eternal reward. She was thrown into a cauldron of oil, but was not burned. When he was then burned by a splash of the cauldron, he repented, that is, the governor, and he released them, but then shortly after ordered them to offer pagan sacrifices again. After they refused, they were crucified, facing each other. They prayed with one another for 10 days before finally giving their lives for Christ. That concludes our study of the martyrs of the 3rd century. Please fill in the blanks with any saints that I may have forgotten or not treated of sufficiently in the comment section below. Let's conclude in prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimis debitoribus nostris. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. God bless you, and may the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your mind anything I've said unpleasing to him or untrue, and we'll see you next time. Bye.